Good evening. This is David Ross, and welcome to the Lions Roar podcast. I wasn't actually sure I'd get on tonight. There is so much going on in New York City regarding gyms, of which martial arts schools are under that umbrella. But I did want to get on here to talk a little bit about Shuai Jiao. So, we use the term Shuai Jiao. We mean the wrestling tradition that is native to China. But the first thing is to talk about the fact that there's a very valid argument that Shuai Jiao may be a 20th century term. It may not even go into the Qing. I've seen two references to, two competing references. One saying that it first sort of appeared in the Qing, and then one saying that it definitely had to do with Ma Liang using that term, and that's when it started being used. So, in my book, for example, I say Shuai Jiao, but I mean, any kind of wrestling that was traditionally done within China. Of course, Chinese wrestling is what they say, but really there's wrestling that was done by the ethnic Han Chinese. There was wrestling that was done by the Hui, which are the Muslims. There's Mongolians, and there's Manchurians, and there's even Tibetan wrestling. So we're talking about wrestling going on within what we consider China in sort of our modern conception of it, and we're using Shuai Jiao just because that's the term that has been adopted. And of that term Shuai Jiao, there's two different ways to write the Chinese characters. One involves, the second character involves horns, going back to the idea that at some point Jiao Di was, wrestling with horned helmets where they got control of you and gored you with the horned helmets. That may be legend. I've also suggested that the idea of two animals locking horns, is like a very good visualization of a wrestling match, especially when you're locking arms, like in bicep ties and moving around. The second one is the Shuai, the throwing or wrestling, and the Jiao, which means very specifically to throw with the legs. And I find that interesting because from the historical sources we have, originally the Chinese, in other words, the Han, when they did Shuai Jiao or did wrestling, even I fall for that term a lot, we're using mostly hand techniques, either 24 or 32 different, mostly hand ways, like hand blocking and, whereas the Mongolians, which are the very famous wrestlers, used a lot of techniques with tripping and sweeping. So that may have indicated the influence of the Mongolians. I would say a couple of things when we talk about Shuai Jiao. People are big in talking about the schools. There's Beijing, Tianjin, Baoding, and Mongolian. Pardon me. Even when I was an undergraduate in history, I had a history professor that said when you read history, it's always important to have a map out and in front of you. And if you open a map to China, particularly to China during the Qing, the imperial period, and you look at Beijing, Tianjin, and Baoding, you realize that they're really not that far apart. They're all sort of the same general area. So, in one sense, it's useful, but in another sense, we're not talking about widely different. Not like talking about wrestling in China and wrestling in the United States, during pre-colonization when the Indians were there. Excuse me. Second, we have to understand that the Shanpuying, which was the team of wrestlers, and more than just wrestlers, they were responsible for teaching the royal family military skills, being horseback riding, shooting bows, archery, and wrestling. They were also bodyguards, and they were, the professional wrestling team, because for the Manchurians, being able to wrestle with the Mongolians, it was a sporting event in one sense, but it was also a diplomatic event in another. And, while I'm writing my second volume of the history book, one of the things that we're going to cover a lot is that not talked about in martial arts circles, and not even talked about in a lot of mainstream history, but in religious history, how important Tibetan Buddhism was used as a linking tool between the Manchurians of the Qing and the Mongolians who had obviously established the Yuan. So the Shanpuying was like a professional martial artist. And originally, the Mongolians were the best wrestlers, and the Manchurians were always losing to them. after the Shanpuying was established, they said that the Manchurians were able to compete and win matches. And so, how did they do that? Well, they did what any person interested in winning, as opposed to preserving tradition, and a lot of this will be familiar if you've been following me and my thoughts on things for years. They just looked at everything. So, the wrestling, whether you want to call it Shui Jiao or Jiao Di or whatever it was, that the Shanpuying was doing, was a combination of Chinese wrestling, Manchurian wrestling, because the Qing were Manchurians. The Manchurian style was supposed to be originally similar to the Chinese, the Han style, being that it was mostly hand techniques, like hand blocking, ko, and shobe and stuff like that. Then combined with the Mongolian. So what we have today is wrestling, very influenced by this, because after the Qing fell apart, all the people in the Shanpuying were no longer able to stay there. There was no Shanpuying. They went out, and with them went the skills that they had learned and the knowledge that they had acquired. And if you look even at what the Muslims in Baoding were doing, Cheng Dongsheng's teacher and his teacher's teacher, his teacher was supposed to be somehow affiliated with Shanpuying. Now, whether he was a member of it or he just studied the methods, and again, people would leave the Shanpuying, not in great numbers during the imperial periods when it was disbanded, but certainly there was, traffic in and out. We're not talking about a specifically Chinese version. The Tongyi's book, which, is really two books specifically on Shuai published in the Republican period, and one is Tongyi's book, and the other is, Ma Liang's book, which is, several volumes, and one of the volumes is dedicated to wrestling. He goes, well, it's Chinese, but that's because we were talking about a period of a really intense nationalism at the time. Really, because he said, well, I'm a Manchurian and I learned from a Mongolian, and there really was no Chinese in there, but he called it Chinese wrestling. But again, that idea of China is sort of what we think of it now as the state. Han techniques practiced by the Muslims. It's not hard to think of Muslims wrestling if you know anything about Muslim culture. The Manchurians and Mongolians, and like I said, the Tibetans. And the Tibetans were freely mixing with the Mongolians and the Manchurians because they all shared, like I said, quote-unquote Tibetan Buddhism or Lamaism. So, it's a synthetic method. It was also organized by the Central Kuoshu Institute. So, for example, Cheng Dongsheng being notoriously, famously associated with that and got a lot of his method. But a lot of other people studied there, and a lot of other people studied their methods. And when I did Encyclopedia of Shuai, or Encyclopedia of Modern Shuai, the book that's on Amazon right now, I showed that for the most part, everyone uses the same terms for basically the same throws. Let me say that again. All the different teachers, no matter what tradition they claim they belong to, Beijing, Baoding, Tianjin, have basically the same throws and use basically the same terms for those throws. There's a couple of variations, and a lot of that has to do, again, with the language problem. Cho. Does it mean cho the picking up or cho the rubbing? I argue a little bit in the book that it was probably both at one point. It might have been, two different techniques, and it just all got mixed together into one. But considering a illiterate to semi-literate culture, which most of these wrestlers were, considering the inherent issues with the Chinese language, the fact that almost everyone uses the same terms for the same throws is actually kind of remarkable, which kind of sort of indicates that it did sort of come from the same source. Now, where is it different? Well, we have the solo forms. I'm a big fan of looking at the solo forms because, for example, in Cheng Dongsheng's Baoding style, the forms that we first saw being brought over by his students, Grandmaster Zheng Xingping, who, is the school that I'm affiliated with, and John Wong and David Lin, and Daniel Wong, and, these people that came over. Some of the forms are very, very simple, and they zigzag, and so they're a lot like the basic Xingyi forms. There, and again, I've always said they're like military drilling. It makes perfect sense. These people weren't doing martial arts, as an art form. It was integrally related to military training. The Shampu Ying considered themselves a military unit. Like I said, part of their responsibility was to teach the royal family their military skills, horseback riding, archery, and wrestling. Part of their job was to, wrestle the Mongolians as a, diplomatic effort. But they were also bodyguards. They were considered military people. The forms. I think that, again, if you look at even high school wrestling, there's a thing called shadow wrestling, which is basically forms, but kind of free form. They don't think of them as forms. They just sort of go through the movements that they would do. Like when you don't have somebody to practice with, you can still sort of like get in front of a mirror and move around and, change levels and shoot a single and shoot a double, and work off of your knees and do a sit out and, and do a hip heist and all these things that you do. I think that these forms were like that. And I don't think they were as standardized as saying like the throws. And I say that because Bao Ding under Cheng has one version of the forms. And then, you look at Li Baoru, who is a Beijing teacher. Pretty famous because he was one of those people that influenced the 78 conference that have ended up creating Sanshou for the civilians. There's a lot of different schools out there. Like I said, I went through something like 9 different books representing about 3 different schools in order to use them as source material for the Encyclopedia of Modern Shui Jiao. The forms can all be different. Now, there's obviously some similarities because, for example, if you're doing T, if you're doing kicking, you got to do something with your leg, otherwise it's not really, working T. But I'll just be bluntly honest, it seems like also in the years that we've watched Shui Jiao, and again, I've been doing Shui Jiao since the 80s, but there are sources going all the way back to, the 70s, Chang publishing material. Some people have come up with pretty elaborate looking forms to supposedly be the Shui Jiao forms. And everybody will tell you this is the secret one that I learned from my grandfather, I learned, from a book I found in a salt shop, the secret manuals. But, we apply Occam's razor, which is really what's the easiest answer. I think the more simple and basic and straightforward a Shui Jiao form is, the more likely it is to the original one. The more it looks pretty and looks kung fu-y, the more likely it's been created in more modern times in order to fit in with the existing kung fu culture around it. There's a lot of cross training to begin with. Cheng Dongsheng was in the Central Koshu Institute. He had to study things like what they called Shaolin and Tan Tui, which is Shaolin, not Shaolin, Muslim long fist. He had Xingping did praying mantis, northern praying mantis. James Chin was originally a long fist student. So there's always been cross training. Now, of course, supposedly the Bao Ding school. I'm just dying today of allergies. I'm sorry. The Bao Ding school had even with Ping, the original teacher had influence of the Hebei long fist methods that were native to the region. In other words, he'd already mixed wrestling with striking to make it more martial. Shampu Ying probably had some striking also because, like I said, they consider themselves bodyguards. Cheng Dongsheng's Shui Jiao definitely has a lot of striking because, like I said, he had all this cross training, and he used it also specifically to train military and police. So he adapted his method to that kind of stuff. But it looks like some of the forms that are being passed off now were specifically like we looked over across the street in the park and saw some people doing long fist and decided to make our forms a little prettier. I'm not a fan of changing something just to make it prettier. And I think if you make the forms too complicated, you're sort of defeating the purpose of the basics of the forms. Like I said, they're good for shadow wrestling, just like somebody in high school wrestling or college wrestling or the Olympic team would do a little bit of shadow wrestling to get warm, but not to learn really elaborate forms. So, I kind of jumped on here. This is a short one. I'm going to still upload it for you. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great night, and welcome to the Lion's Roar.